All right, Agnes. So, for the past dozen or so entries, I have been starting from the end and then working my way back to the beginning. And I think with this entry, I'll make a little bit of an exception because I think that there were a few basics about orchestration that I could help you with, and it's really better if we think from the beginning forward, I think, rather than from the end backwards, if you know what I mean. So I mean, to start off with, um, let let's talk a little bit about the layout of the score, and and some other things. All right, so the first thing is, it's pretty obvious here that you intend for there to be two of each wind instrument and two of each brass instrument, or perhaps just a single bass trombone. I'll check as we go forward. But you have to tell us how many of each you have right here. I think you should go watch a video that I have called "Instrument Names," like what orchestra librarians want you to know about instrument names. So, so I think that would help you to lay out your score. You might have noticed the template, right? And how I think my template might have mentioned like how many instruments I recommended using and so on. So try to preserve that. the next time that you enter the orchestration challenge, which I really hope you will. I mean, I'm thinking forward to uh, next year's challenge, and I'm just really thinking that this score is going to possibly be really really good for you. It'll really be a positive experience. I'm not saying it will particularly cater to your sensibilities or your experience or anything like that, but I think it'll have some parts in it that are very very helpful to you. So yeah, so this should be two flutes, two oboes, two clarinets in A, two bassoons, two horns, and so on, two trumpets in C. So we need to know all that information. Of course, you don't have to tell us how many violins and violas and so on. That's all fine. But just, go refer to some orchestral scores, some printed scores, and you'll see exactly what I mean from right from the beginning. All right, so starting off here, you're starting your flute, and it's very simply scored. There are very few slurs. There are places where I think you could slur, like you could slur from here to there, or possibly from here to there. So there are some places, or here, right in here, right? And there are also some places where you are changing from an interval, like in this case an octave, to a single note, and like for instance here you say one, right? But maybe that should be right here, right? Written right there, because, or if you want this to be both players, you have to write the letter A and then the number 2, right? So a due in Italian. Okay. Then right here at the beginning, you start off really at just the top of the flute, and you're asking mezzo piano. So you want to think that most pitches from A upwards, from the high A upwards, are really like they're louder and wilder than you are imagining here. Here you go all the way up to a D, which most players cannot get to without really, putting a lot of force into it. Because just to get the note to speak requires more force. And I would say the same thing would be true for high C here on top. So if you want to maintain that sense of beautiful freedom and playability and nuance, then probably what you should do is you should add a piccolo part. So you should just basically put everything on top here on piccolo. And then what I would do is I would treat the piccolo part as if it were played by the second flute player. And so when the piccolo part is finished, if you need more flute players lower down, then you can have the piccolo player change to a flute. Okay? And then this part would be taken by the first player. Now, you never need to do this. Number 1 on top, number 2 on the bottom. We know, if you only have 2 flute players, that the top player is the first and the bottom player is the second. There's no need to mark it. Now here, oboe, we sort of have the number 1 floating around. It should be right over the first note. Okay? And then continuing on, it's all fine. Then here you have like part number 1, and here you have part number 2, but we're not really sure what happens afterwards. If this is part 2 continuing on, that's great, but you need to have a rest in the first voice here. And I think that there are ample opportunities for slurs here as well. This could be slurred. This could be slurred, right? This could be slurred right here up to the repeated note. And I'm seeing you're having a few little problems with the way things are laid out, and the you wrote in, looks like you wrote in some key signatures and other things in your score, and that's perfectly fine. Now, as to the scoring, you start off here with just like a single melody, like no accompaniment or anything, and that is also very cool. I think that approach is fine. And then you're just adding just the most basic kind of accompaniment from clarinet, and then adding another voice and so on from oboe, just keeping it really simple. So some things to think about with oboe. Scoring down here to C and B, this is the louder register of the oboe, in which it's difficult for them to play extremely softly and subtly, right? It's harder for them to sort of match up. Like if you have clarinet down here in the chalumeau register, and it's sort of playing very moodily and having kind of a cool color, the oboe on top of it is going to have a much fuller, richer sound. So the timbral balance will be a little difficult to manage. You haven't made it easy for your players. Yeah. Yeah, so clarinet in A. Yep, okay. Right, I'm just making sure that I've got the right. Now, there are some finer points for you to consider, which I'll mention now before we move on. And that is, we're telling a story here in music, right? And it's just like a sentence. If you listen to the way that I'm talking, my voice rises and falls for a certain emphasis in certain places, right? So that is something that you want to bring into your music. It's not enough to find colors and registers of instruments that work together. They should also breathe. There should be moments where the music gets louder and softer and tells a story. And you can also tell a story by changing the color of the instruments and the interaction of the instruments. Check out some of the other entries and just look at some of the different ways that people change the texture by shifting between instruments or between registers of instruments, right? So I would say don't just get stuck in one zone with your scoring. Allow yourself to explore more possibilities of expression. Okay, so for instance, here there could have been a crescendo, da 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 ba dum bum, right, and you could have had a slow crescendo here, da 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 da, right, and now you've achieved. You're somewhere sort of made to be medium loud here, da 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 da, and then diminuendo, right. Also, one last thing is, I would say that the color of the instrument is already beautiful in piano. I don't think it needs to be mezzo piano, right? There's just so much mezzo in here. I think you forgot to tell us which instrument and what dynamic there is here. I think that it's perfectly fine for this to be scored in piano, especially if this is going to be piccolo. It has a beautiful sound up there. So, so think about those things. All right, and now let's go forward to our to the next section, the second half of the A section. And yeah, so here we've got the melody, and I think that you could have added slurs here. You have a little bit of kind of a strange syncopation here, and I think this might be a mistake. You probably intended this to be dotted quarter note as well. There are quite a few little mistakes in this in the transcription of this piece, and perhaps you copied some of this out rather than using my template. You entered the notes by looking at the screen, by looking at the original copy of the music, and that's fine. But I just don't have time to point them all out. There's a lot to cover in this, and I want to make sure that we get that you totally get your time's worth, your effort's worth in this. All right, because you must understand, Agnes, that even though I'm going to be giving you a lot of I don't know if critical is the right word. I'm going to be giving you a lot of feedback about the workability, right? So think about that word, workability, like how well something works. I'm going to be giving you a lot of feedback about that, but it does not mean that you didn't score something beautiful. It's obvious that you made choices in this that appealed to you, that felt beautiful to you, that made the piece live for you. And I sense a lot of that. So please do not take it too personally, all right? If I have a lot to say about how to fix things and how to more fully realize your intentions, right? So that is what this is all about. This is me finding ways for you to take what you have scored and make it even better, make it even more playable, to get it ready for the stands, right? For the music stands, whereupon it will be read by the musicians who are going to play it. So think about the bowing here for the musicians. They could go down bow and then up bow with the slur connecting forward, and then down bow again and up bow. So it makes a nice even exchange of bows back and forth. Now here you have a slight problem in that you have 2 repeated C's in a row. I really like the fact that you didn't throw in rests here, as some entries did, but you kept the flow going. Why not use this E rather than the C, and with having a repeat with a slur over it? Why not have the line go forward and then jump up to E and come back, and then here you have F sharp and then E, F sharp. I think that might work really, really well. One thing that you should be aware of is that the double basses, while they do have a lot of agility and they can almost play everything that the cellos can, it still is a lot more work for them to play a line like this. And the other thing too is that you are scoring something that remains consistent throughout. I'll turn the page in a minute and you'll see. But with that sound just continuing on and on and on with both of the instruments in the same functions again and again, with that amount of thickness, gives your scoring a lot of weight on the bottom, and I think it might be preventing this texture from being as light as it could be. Now, having said all that, I think that you have a lovely approach here. You've got the melody on top. You're sort of holding back a little bit on. You're having the flute continue holding, kind of almost like a piano, pedaled piano work, where some pitches continue forwards and others don't. So this works pretty nicely. Now, turning the page. We can see that the functions are pretty much set where they were at the beginning of the passage. Now, once again, Agnes, because you have really wonderful instincts about what should sound good and how to put some of these sections together, I wonder how much more you could have gotten out of this by gradually progressing, adding more color with other instruments, changing, having conversations between different instruments, trading off between different functions with maybe the basses and the cellos trading off with the bassoons and the clarinets. Maybe, there are ways of maintaining interest. And the other thing that's important here too is dynamic variation, right? So there's almost no dynamic variation at all. It continues on at the same exact dynamics. So that is another thing that I think could make your score stronger, is having more dynamic fluctuations, more variations, more nuances. So you can see that this really continues on for quite a long time. It is a long time to be, at the speed that we're going, to be having these basses and cellos play in exactly the same configuration in that octave. You're also sending your basses up. It's not too high. You're going all the way up to G here, and it's certainly playable, but it is, after a while, the weight of having the basses really double exactly what's happening in the cellos in such a flowing passage. I think it might, after a while, seem almost a parody. Do you know what I mean? Almost as if the it's wearing out its welcome a little bit to the ear, maybe intentionally, right? So you don't want the audience to think that you are kind of using that psychology on them. I think that you want to be able to let the music breathe a little bit and fluctuate more. It's nice the way that you're using double stops, or divisi, sorry, you're using divisi in this. And you should really mark every part where it happens. So divisi here, divisi there, and there. Now, a lot of this is very easy to play, though, non-divisi. These sixths are very simple. I mean, this is nothing that I couldn't have played as a teenage violin player. Okay, so I like the way that you're adding more function here in the middle, having the violas join in. This is very powerful in here. I wonder, though, whether or not there's too much weight on the lower voice here. Couldn't the cellos go up to play D, C, B, rather than B, A, G? Because really what happens here is that this upper voice becomes sidelined. It has very little power if the cellos and the double basses are going to be playing the lower line with the violas. So couldn't the cellos jump up and play this, D, C, B, and then maybe the basses could stay with B, A, G? Yeah, because that just, here, like it just feels a little unnatural. The bottom part of the thirds is getting most of the focus. And, this, I would say the same thing in all of these places. Yeah, same thing here. B, A, G works better. E, C, E. Yeah. These are very long bows, but they're certainly playable, but they are a lot of work, I would say to practice up and so on. But, nothing that a professional couldn't handle. Let's take a look at the next page now. So if there's one thing that I would say about this section is that we end up with these high pitches in our flutes and these harmonies in the upper strings. And looking at the previous page, you could see that it really was just the same consistent texture all the way through until suddenly we got to here. So I would say try to think of ways of leading into this, when you have a radical change of texture where you really are kind of dropping a lot of things along the way. Try to set it up a little bit more so that the sections follow each other more naturally. Here we've got the bassoons, and I would dovetail on this note. I'm seeing a lot of dovetailing of 2 or 3 notes, but the players will be listening to each other, and when they get to that single note, they will trade off in a beautiful way, and you will never even know, right, that they didn't take 3 notes, unless their quality of timbre is wildly uneven. And with Chalumeau register clarinet and that's actually in the throat tones, but throat tone clarinet and tenor register bassoon, there is absolutely no problem in there being a seamless dovetailing right in here, so long as they're really listening to each other and they're professionals. I really love the way that this wanders up and plays over these notes. It's beautiful. And then you answer with your strings. That's also lovely. I would recommend one thing to you here, Agnes, and that is, I think that these parts here should be played by the second violin. I think you want your strongest players, your first violins, to be playing along with the violas. And another thing that you might do is you might dovetail with the violas a lot earlier. You could dovetail on this high note here or back one note. I know that makes the viola part seem a little short, and certainly the violas can continue to play. But if you do want to have the violas last until the end of the bar, I think that you should go to treble clef here, and then you should have the violas play all the way through to this A. Okay, and then that should be the note at which the instruments trade off, right? As opposed to this A here, right? So it really should be EA trading off into the next part. I think that just makes a whole lot more sense. All right, now we have a transcription of the next part. Da 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 do da da do da do. And here, I think that you need to consider, like, it's not enough to just have the note of E in the sound picture. I think you need the actual held melody note of E to be played by the instrument that is going to carry the melody forward. And certainly, your oboe can play that note. So if you had the oboe holding that high E, and then tying forward, and then slurring down and so on, I think that this passage would make a lot more sense. And you do not have to change anything else in the entire piece. I think it all works fine. Here you use bass clarinet on your you use bass clef on your clarinet. Never do this. Always use treble clef. Perhaps this is left over from when you were sketching your orchestration. But do not do this, okay? Get rid of the clef change. It should all be in treble clef. The clarinet player has no problem reading low notes in treble clef, but they do have a problem reading in bass clef, of which they have usually no experience unless they play a lot of bass clarinet and like German parts in bass clarinet. But then that means something different, okay? So do not do this. And I like the duo between the oboe and the unison, I should say, between the oboe and the harp, but I think that it should continue on. I don't think the harp should just stop. I think that the harp should continue on to the last note. All right, now we're going to this part in here. You have horns scored in bass clef. You do not need to do that. Absolutely do not need to score these horns in bass clef. Only use the bass clef in horns when the notes are extremely low. And I mean as low as, say, E below the staff, D, C, in that area going all the way down to the second G below written middle C. All right? That would be a much more appropriate range within which to score your horns in a low register. Now here you're going all the way down to this written E, but that still is no justification for scoring the horns in bass clef. Keep them in treble clef. Once more, you do not need to write 1 and 2. If you have intervals like this, we know that they're the 1 and 2. That who else could they be, right? They could not be any other player. So that is your guide there. This is a lovely combination here of these two voices, oboe and clarinet. Anybody who thinks oboe and clarinet cannot play a unison has not heard Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. And I think that you get that same beautiful quality here. And I also like this little touch of viola right in here. There is, I think, no reason why the violas couldn't be playing both pitches along with the horns here. Now, if you're going to be playing this, I think that we need a little bit of guidance here. I would, if I were conducting this, I would not know what this meant, because first you have unmeasured tremolo, then you have unmeasured fingered tremolo, but you have another part where it is only going back and forth, it's alternating in eighths. I would probably turn to you, especially looking at this unmeasured tremolo here, I would probably turn to you at the rehearsal and I would say, Agnes, what do you mean here? And you might look at the part and you might say, oh my goodness, they're all supposed to be triple beam, right? So just see, maybe proofread this a little bit more. It's just hard to know. Any situation like this, I would write out the first group. If this were really intended to be alternating 16th notes, I would write them out clearly, and then I would go to the abbreviation. However, I think that you actually intend this for this both to be unmeasured fingered tremolo going back and forth. Now, since that is the case, you should probably also add a slur covering all of those, because it will probably be all under one bow. Now, if you don't intend it to be under one bow and you intend it to be like kind of furious back and forth, which I don't think that you intend, still, you might want to mark it détaché or some other kind of indication to just really let us know. But like that, it would be hell on people's wrists to do that for any length of time. So I will assume and recommend that you have this slurred across. Now, the first group can be going back and forth between dotted quarter notes, but the second group should be the next half of the bar under dotted, just with two dotted, going back and forth between two dotted half notes, right? So you don't need to keep repeating the same rhythm. Like same thing here, two dotted half notes, rather than four dotted quarter notes. Now here, I am not so sure that this is possible, and I would want to consult with a bassoonist before giving them a part that just went da la 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 la. It may be, and here what you're asking the player to do is to play flutter tonguing on a bassoon, so they would be going brrrr, and I'm not really sure that this is what you want. So I'm not so sure that copy pasting from here to here is exactly what you intend. You might get away with having a trill here, or a back and forth between a shorter length. I'm just feeling here, from what I remember about bassoon, that this would be pretty difficult to play, and you certainly should have a slur over this. All right? And then I'm noticing a tendency in these scores, the application that you're using, for these triple beam tremolos to jump up into the next staff. In any case, try to have your stems longer so that the tremolo beams are much higher and there's some space, because the triple beam should not be interfering with the note head. But having said that, you probably shouldn't try this approach with the bassoon. I would not recommend it. Now, going on here, we're seeing the horns continue on, and some of these pitches are a little low. Here we have the E. Here we are going all the way down to D sharp. I still don't see anything that really justifies using bass clef. I understand your concern. I know you don't want this score to look wrong, but it is actually more wrong to use bass clef. I would only use, like, if you were really worried about it, I would only use bass clef like maybe here or there. But even at that, going all the way down to D sharp, hornists can read that all day long. The question is where the weight of the notes are. If they are mostly in the middle register like this, then it should be in treble clef. Certainly, horn players do not, horn players would much rather read low ledger lines in treble clef than read high ledger lines in bass clef. High ledger lines and bass clef is something that they do not like to read, and I can tell you that from having talked to several disgusted horn players who got parts like that, right? So you do not want to annoy your horn player. Okay, so we are moving forward to a new section, okay? And while this does work, I want you to think about something, Agnes, and that is, from what I'm seeing of your scoring, you are somebody who cares a lot about tone color and cares a lot about the musicality and the expression of the work. And I do think you are concerned about telling a story. So I want you to think to yourself that you have, your overflowing ideas could certainly affect some kind of change going forward into a new section, right? The strategy that you're using here in your scoring is pretty much the same between C and D. So, and it does not really change until the next page. So I think that you could get more out of this rather than continuing to use the same approach. All right. Now here, there is a slight difference in the way that the octaves are working. I think that this is possible on flutes. I would probably use just one flute instead of two. But it's probably much more natural to play smaller intervals or trills or other kinds of things. Or just to go, you know, just to have eighth notes going back and forth rather than 16th or 32nd notes. Yeah, and this is nice coming in here. See, like this works beautifully on these instruments. Okay, well, there isn't a whole lot more to say because it's the same approach, which more or less works. But I feel you could be definitely getting much more out of this texture by adding more elements. Now we're getting into more complex scoring. Here we've got octave flutes in here, and you're taking the flutes very low, and you're taking them up to fortissimo, and they have to play this against very loud instruments everywhere else. Now, Agnes, if you remember one thing from this coaching session, I want you to remember this, and I want you to write it down, okay? And that is low flutes, flutes in their first octave, they cannot compete against brass, against loud strings. They disappear. The first octave of the flute is the most gentle, delicate, beautiful, exquisite sound in the orchestra sometimes. Some people would disagree. But it has the potential for so much beautiful expression in a soft way when it is not surrounded by so much noise. But the way that you have scored this, there is no way that this second flute player will be heard by anyone. And that they will be happy to play it, and I'm sure that they will sound fine to themselves sitting in their chair, but nobody is going to be able to hear them with these massive octaves in your first violins, and even more weight from your second violins, and even horns would be enough to wipe out the sound of these second violins. And here you have your oboes, which are much more suited to that register in terms of projection, loudness, and so on. And they're not being used. So I would say give your second flute part to your oboe player or your clarinet player. Okay, Agnes? And I think that will really balance out this line. There is nothing wrong with the flute, the way that it's scored. However, you are bringing in trumpets here, and once again, the scoring is much, much too high for bass clef. You should have not had any bass clef at all, right? You did not need it ever in the passage that we just had. So, but back to this question here. You're adding trumpets, you're making the sound fuller, okay? And it's nice the way that you have this scored, but I think that some of the pitches here could also be shared between oboes and clarinets to make a fuller sound. And then when you get to here, you could continue on with horns contributing, with more trombones, and you could take this octave melody up an octave, and that way you could still have second flute on the bottom, but it would be an octave higher, right? And then it would be much more natural to jump up to this high C sharp here. And the same thing could be happening with your violins. They could be playing an octave higher along with your flute. And this part in here could be filled in more. it could be as something as simple as the second violins playing this part, right? You just give this part to the second violins, and then the first violin part is an octave higher. And then this part here can, a lot of the harmony that you have in here given to the trumpets are loud enough. They do not need to be doubled by the violins here. They will work on their own. Now, the question that you have to think about here is, do you really want this to be a smooth kind of a sound? Did you listen to the piano part? Did you notice how that great piano player, Violina Petrochenko, was hammering away with the left hand? So, if we want that same energy and that same ferocity, you might not want to slur things. You might want to have accent marks or staccato marks or some other kind of sort of savagery in here. And you might want some of this doubled by some of your other instruments. Is it possible that maybe the bassoon could be playing this, and the second bassoon could be playing the octaves and so on, and these low long notes, and then the cellos could be doubled by the first bassoon, and they could all be playing accents or staccato together rather than the kind of smoother slurs. Because here you have repeated notes, and the dynamic is fortissimo, and here we have a forte, and that's fine. The balance is fine at forte, and I would have this at forte, not at mezzo forte. So if you have these repeated notes going boom, 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 and this here, then I really think that the slurs here might be a mistake for your approach. Here, you really only need one single football like this, or football, I shouldn't say football, that doesn't mean anything. One single dotted whole note here with the triple tremolo beam over it. You don't need a separate one on each note. Now, if you really do want emphasis, like each one of these emphasized, then write an accent on it. So, But otherwise, if you just intend it to go all the way through, then just have a single dotted whole note with the triple tremolo beam over it. You don't need to have 4 separate pitches here. Now here, you're using something that I just don't understand exactly. The way that you've scored it, you're using the timpani roll sign over it, the trill, but you are writing in a little secondary note as if you really want a real trill, as if it were, say, a wind instrument, alternating back and forth between 2 pitches. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this, other than a mock-up, but it is a very kind of confused, sloppy sound, all right? I would say, before you write this into a score and send it to a conductor, be absolutely sure that that is exactly what you intend. Like, really, really make sure. Have a timpanist play this for you. Now, we have some other problems in here in terms of, like, where the notes are falling. Like, here you are, like, we are in 12/8, right? So this is, these durations of these notes are kind of outside the time signature, right? It is more like it's more like this is in 3/2, is what it really feels like to me. You have 3 groups of 2 beats. And if that is the case, you should write 3/2 here. Like, you should give this part a separate time signature, right? And they will still be able to follow the conductor. But perhaps you were not thinking, and you actually did intend this to be 2 dotted half notes, two dotted quarter notes in a row, and for this to fall in the middle of the bar. So check that out, okay? Now, before I turn the page, I really love the way the flutes are going up to this octave. And that just suggests to me all along that I was right. I think that the flute should be up the octave, from here. So this should be this should be D octaves an octave higher, you know, ba 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 da 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 da. This whole thing should be up an octave from this D. Same thing with your first violins. Turn the second violins into this part here. You do not, you know, with this, with the amount of color and harmony that you're going to be getting into your parts, you don't really need your second violins to be playing these harmonies in here. Even with just the trumpets, that is perfectly enough, but you could be adding more harmony in here, just like I said all along, with your wind parts. All right, now I'll turn the page. Continuing on here, I really like the way you are bringing in more color, more harmony with your middle winds here. I like the way that the horns and the trumpets are working here. I think that they could be playing more pitches. I think that this is a little underpowered. I don't think the bassoon, I don't think you need to have both bassoons on this. I think one of the bassoonists could be doubling the cellos here. And perhaps the other part could be covered by another instrument. Is there some other voice that you could spare? Perhaps you don't need, perhaps you could sacrifice one of your trumpet players. The trumpet will be twice as strong as the horn in this situation, so you could have both horns playing this one pitch. You could have your first trumpet playing this pitch, and you could have your second trumpet going back and forth on these pitches. It gets a little low there. It kind of gets down to A, and here it gets down to G. I mean, it's a little weird. Maybe it's more of it might be better on horn, but there are ways of, compensating. Here the oboe and clarinet parts are pretty much playing the same thing. So that I would actually just say use second clarinet. Forget what I said before. Don't use trumpet or horn. Just use first bassoon and second clarinet to double these parts, to give them more. They need more weight. Now, I do not understand, Agnes, why you dropped out here and all of a sudden you're soft. So I'm wondering if you had intended to have diminuendo here to get gradually softer and softer, and that's why you dropped out some parts. Here we've got this is something that I forgot to mention on the previous page, alta bassa. All right, so that means an octave lower than the notes written. So this low A sharp here is impossible on a standard tuba. I don't think you need alta bassa on these tuba parts, and I think that you need to think a little bit more about what you really want here. I think that you probably intended to have the tuba part doubling the double basses, and if that is so, then it's already on the pitches that they need to play. You do not need this line at all. All right, so this is all quietening down. In the original piano score, it did not have a diminuendo. In fact, Barvinsky wanted the pianist to keep playing loudly. However, the interpretation is up to you. You get to decide whether or not that's right, and if it's not right for you, then that's fine. However, I would have a diminuendo on these parts here, your middle strings. So have them diminuendo down to pianissimo, so that when they let go, they are fading out rather than just stopping. Okay, so here you're coming in with bum, 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 bum. My only problem with this, Agnes, is that, there are two problems. One is that these are just the same notes twice. In the original piano score, it gets even lower, right? It's an octave lower. However, you can't reach those notes on a bassoon. This would be a strong argument to have, say, tuba play them, right? The tuba can reach all the way down to that extremely low E. But the bassoon can't. So in order to avoid just playing the same four notes twice, right? Now, the other problem is, here you have a portato. You have slurred tenuto. So you get the effect of, right? rather than da 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 da, like it has a sort of a zooming sound if you take away the slur. So I think that you could definitely have a portato here as well, right? And you get the same kind of almost bouncing or pulsing effect. Now here, I think that you should complete the phrase. Don't just go straight from cellos to violas. Have the cello finish it. Da 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 da. It should be the cello continuing on rather than, because like you get a difference in tone quality. Da 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 da. It's almost like, here you have like a nice deep male voice, and then here you have more of a tenor suddenly singing, and you'll just notice the tone quality. All right. And here I think you could, once again, you could use slurs. Da 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 da. Do you know, as opposed to da da dun? I think slurs are a really, really good idea here. I think this is really beautiful up here. Once again, you don't need to tell us that this is 2 or +2. As soon as you add 2 instruments, we know that both players are playing. All right, and once again, there's no need for this. 1 and 2, we know that they're there. This actually happened in a few scores. Maybe I will mention it in a separate tip. But I think that this was really lovely here at the end. Just some real common sense, simple, effective, and beautiful scoring. Now here we're continuing. Da 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 ba da. And this was nice. Now we do have one problem, and that is there is no way that horns can play this high. I'm going to jump back to the previous page. And pardon me for not catching this earlier. I still had my head stuck in the bass clef, but I had noticed this when I studied your score earlier, and it was something that I intended to talk to you about. So these parts look like they are copy-pasted directly from the flute part, right? But the horn part is not in reading C, concert pitch. It's reading in F. So these pitches would be very much different from what you are saying, what you are asking for here. So yeah, so this just is not possible, I'm afraid. The highest note on a horn is C. What's more, notes from F upwards become more and more difficult to control until they are very loud, or if they're not loud, if the composer is asking the horn player to play them very soft, they become painful after a while. So yeah, just really, really watch out with this kind of scoring. I think what you intended to score here was like oboes, right? If you had a mixture of oboes and flutes here, I think it would sound absolutely beautiful. No need to score horns in out of range areas like this, okay? All right, so continuing on. Yeah, so it's just kind of confusing the way that this is scored. Yeah, these notes are just up on top are really not possible. That high C sharp and this D here, things become more possible, but if you're playing softly here on a high B, that is also not very likely. Or I mean, it is workable, but it is painful and it's not good for it. It'll have a strange, slightly sore throat kind of character. Yeah, I mean, better to have scoring like this in the oboes. All right, so I'm not going to worry too much about the horn going forward, but I think that this all works pretty well, the clarinet and the flute and so on, and I think that the flute here is absolutely beautiful. So Agnes, thinking about how you end this piece with this, this beautiful melody on low flute. So can you hear and recognize the beauty of this register, right? And how special that is, and how it has such a velvety sound, and how absolutely important it is that that register not be accompanied too thickly by other instruments. What you have here in these pitches, this all works fine. This is perfectly fine. I would not end on a G, I would end on an E, right? And I would have no pitches above this E, sounding E, for the horn. I would really absolutely not have a G, I would have an E here. Perhaps this was a mistake. Da 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 da, not da 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 da. I think that like this basically says this is G major, but you want to avoid coming out and saying I'm ending on G major because this is an impressionist piece. You want things to be a little bit vague, a little bit mysterious, right? So end on an E. But getting back to the whole timbral quality of low flute. So thinking about how special and how gorgeous and how luscious and how soft and sensitive this is, does it make sense to ask the flutes to be playing fortissimo or the second flute to be playing fortissimo in this register in a massive passage? It doesn't, does it? Right. So just really remember that lesson. If you remember nothing else, really think about scoring low flute. And I would add this to anybody out there who's watching this. And I hope a lot of people are watching this particular lecture. I think this is an incredibly important lecture as a part of the curriculum that we've got here. Especially for developing orchestrators who are starting, right from square one, like Agnes might have a while back. And I think Agnes is developing as an orchestrator and getting better and better. But I think that, really, really do not score low flute in really loud passages, especially competing with horns and loud strings and things like that. It just does not have a chance to contribute meaningfully to the sound picture. So I can hear my neighbor starting to hammer on something, so let's get to the final page. I think this is also beautiful in here, the way the clarinet helps finish things out. And then the horn takes things down further. Now, it almost seems, I'm thinking about, yeah, okay. Da 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 da. Right. So yeah, so that's a really beautiful ending right in there. I'm not going to address the issue of the horn, except that like, if this scored the way that it is, that's perfectly legitimate to use bass clef in this way. All right? Okay, Agnes, so, you were a supporter at a fairly high level, and you took on a really massive responsibility in scoring this piece all the way through. And I want you to feel really happy and proud with yourself about the work that you did here, all right? And I absolutely do not want you to take it the wrong way that I spent a lot of time talking about some basics of orchestration, all right? I think that that is what you need in your scoring right now. And there is absolutely no question that the overall effect of your score is a very beautiful one, okay? Even though I made suggestions, do you think you could do, add some things here, or, change the texture, or add some variety and not go on too long the same way? Even though I said all of those things, there's no question that the strategies that you undertook do work, okay? So I would love to see you participate in next year's challenge. I think that, it is such a different work, a different style of music from a different genre and a different state of mind and a different culture and a different time period. I think that it would, move you to ever more fascinating and poetic development in your scoring. All right, but it will be a lot of work for everybody, including me. So saying that, I just want to thank you so much that, for the courage that you showed in taking this on, and for the amount of dedicated support that you put into this year's challenge in terms of supporting the channel and supporting my plea for help for Ukrainian musicians. I think that was extremely meaningful and a wonderful gesture. And I want to thank you for that, just especially. It meant a lot to me, and it still does. And I'll always remember all the people who helped me out with this appeal. And, thanks to all my other Patreon subscribers and my website subscribers, all my viewers. You guys are awesome. You have made this one of the best orchestration challenges ever. In a lot of ways, it really was the most massive. Even though I did not get as many entries in terms of numbers, the amount of actual time, because of the vast amount of people submitting full-length entries, was actually more in terms of the amount of pages of score and so on. And maybe that's as it should be. There are more full-length entries from people with a vast, different. I'm using the word vast too much. From a broad range of experiences, perspectives, and levels of craft and so on. And I think it's really, really great to get a score like this from you, Agnes, and that you really put in the work, and this is such a challenge for you, and for and such an important part of your growth as an orchestrator. Okay, so thank you so much for bringing this, and I would really appreciate it if all of our viewers who are still with us would do Agnes the courtesy of jumping in a constructive way and helping her out with your insights, your perspectives, and suggestions for her in tackling things like this. And you may know why there were certain problems like this, the transposition thing with the horn and so on, and the playback and everything else. You might have more experience with her app than I do. All right. Thanks, everybody. I loved this evaluation. It was just, I'm getting towards the end of this workday, and it really energized me and made me just really appreciate my role in this and be thankful for what I've got. So that's all for now. More fun stuff coming soon.